Ah,
Welcome, welcome to the August meetup of the Jacksonville Java User Group, and we are at the Adeco building in a very rainy Jacksonville. It's very hot, but also very rainy. And we have two incredible speakers today, Theresa and Kadi. And because we're sort of behind, I will just let them get started. Once I figure out how to disappear. Here we go. I'm leaving the stage to you.
Okay, I will share my screen.
I think first and foremost, though, while Teresa's pulling this up, I just want to say on behalf of Theresa and I, thank you so much, everyone, for giving us this opportunity to come and present today. I've been so excited about this for a month. So it's just finally happening. So I'm really excited and just thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, same. Maybe we can come in person next time when you're having better weather.
For sure.
All right. Well, I know we're getting started a little late. I don't think this will probably not take a full hour, so we can hopefully get you all heading home at a reasonable time. But feel free to ask questions throughout or at the end. And yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you all. And I know there's various levels of cybersecurity knowledge here, so hopefully there's something to get out of it for everyone. So CVE 101, I guess we can start by introducing ourselves. So as I already told some of you, my name's Theresa Mammarella. I'm currently a software engineer at IBM, and the majority of my career has been spent working on Java virtual machines and compiler projects. Specifically right now, I'm working on OpenJ9, which is IBM's JVM. But one of the things that drives me working in software development is getting to work on tools that other developers use and languages and think about how we use them and can make them better. So I also had a stint working in cybersecurity as well, working on developer tooling. And so that is kind of what brought this talk about. While I was there, I learned so much about cybersecurity that I just had no idea about before being a developer for a long time. And so I wanted to kind of share that with other developers because it is really important to know at least the baseline knowledge of security or where you can go to find out more about it.
Great. And my name's Kadi McKean. You'll see Kadi Grigg. I got married, so my name's changed, but you'll see it in a bunch of different places like this. So I met Theresa when we were working at the security company and where I was a developer advocate there, and had a podcast called Wicked Good Development where we interviewed some of the best in the Java space. So if you have a chance, check it out. If not, if you have a cool story, though, I'm starting a new podcast, so please let me know. Love to get you on. But I'm also a contributing journalist to It's 505, so that's open source and cybersecurity updates every day, Monday through Friday. And that's about it.
Nice.
Let's
yeah,
just kick this off.
All the fun cybersecurity stories. Yeah.
So I just wanted to start with this slide, right? So I just want to make sure we're all on an even playing field because oftentimes I feel like there's so many different statistics you're seeing, and I just want to make sure we're level set and we're all looking at the same one. So if you look at this, and you can read it, in 2023, the global annual cost of cybercrime is predicted to top 8 trillion. And for me, that's like a mind-boggling number. And it's like, how do you get there? Or like, how is that possible? And the answer is extremely simple. It's profitable, right? People can make a ton of money off this. If you look at North Korea, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And since 2014, they've been killing it on ransomware and malware, to the point where they've probably taken over $1 billion between the Sony attacks, WannaCry, and even stealing from Bangladesh's national bank. And if you think about it even more, next slide, please. And if you think about it even further, right, like GDP is one of the biggest indicators of like economic performance, right? It's really like the scorecard or economic health for countries. And if you think about it, based off these numbers, cybercrime, if it was measured by GDP, would be number 3. And to me, that is just that's just mind-boggling. So for now, I know this was a lot of numbers. We'll just let this sink in while you think about what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so what we've got today is, first of all, we'll talk about some security basics and terms that everyone should know. I know there's a variety of experience in this room. And we'll talk about vulnerability tracking and the disclosure process and how it works and all of the nuances that go into it in the field of cybersecurity. And then finally, we'll talk about what cybersecurity practices for developers. So just some things that you should know and be thinking about when you go to work as a software developer. All right, so starting with the very, very basics, the terms that you'll hear pretty often, I'm sure you're all at least a little bit familiar with, are vulnerability, threat, and risk. So often you'll hear some of these terms used kind of interchangeably, especially vulnerability and risk. But usually when we talk about them, vulnerability is some kind of a weakness or a flaw in a system. It could be a technical flaw or it can be some kind of human flaw. The threat is an action that can result in a loss. So someone trying to attack a system, for example. And then the risk is how likely it is that that vulnerability and that threat combined together is going to result in some kind of loss. And the way these relate to each other, or the most simple way that I know at least, is that vulnerability and threat together are equal a risk measurement. And the goal of having a security strategy in place is ultimately to have no risk. So how do we get to no risk? One of these, we all know some basic math. One of these needs to be 0 in order for risk to be 0. And so if we look at threat is the intent to do harm. And that is something that I'm not in control over if someone decides to have an intent to do harm to me. But what I am in control of is the vulnerabilities in my system. And so that really is kind of the focus of where we're looking to be able to minimize the vulnerabilities to minimize risk. And so in the software industry, the way that we talk about and communicate vulnerabilities is with something called CVEs. Again, this is probably really old news to all of the cybersecurity workers in the audience, but just to get us on a level playing field. So this is a public database of information that all of these CVEs exist in public databases and are available to see. And so a CVE is a record of a vulnerability. So they all have numbers. You'll see these really long numbers, but one good thing to know is that the first set of numbers is the year that it was done. And there's always some kind of description and then references that you'll see as well. These are typically some kind of proof of concept or something to describe and anything related to the vulnerability. As I mentioned before, these are all stored in public databases, the most common being the National Vulnerability Database. So when we're calculating vulnerabilities of a system, there may be a few, there may be a lot, but one of the next question to ask once they're identified is, of course, like which one to address first. And so that is addressed partially in this database. You'll see these scores all down the side, and that is what it's trying to address, is the severity of the issue. And so all of these scores, you'll see typically version 3. And since last year, the National Vulnerability Database has stopped publishing version 2, but on some of the older ones, you'll see both kinds of scores. One thing to note about that is if you do see, because they're different versions, they score things a little bit differently. And usually 3.1 tends to score things a little bit higher than 2.0. So if you see conflicting scores, if you ever look at this, that is why. So what goes into these types of scores? There are 3 different categories that go into this risk score. So there's the base metric group, the temporal metric group, and environment. When you see a score published, typically what it's talking about is this base group here on the left. And that is anything to do with a risk that doesn't have to do with a time and doesn't have to do with a very specific environment, basically. Sometimes the environment ends up coming into play in the base metric group a little bit if there's a very common use case where people are like common type of system that is being used for the vulnerability, but usually that's reserved for the environmental group. And the environmental metric is really more of like a framework for companies to go in and evaluate their own risk. Usually you won't see that turn up in scores. So all of this information is public. It's all there so that software companies can go in and look at it and evaluate their own resources. But the problem with having all this information being public is that that vulnerability data is unavailable for attackers to see as well. So that threat part of the equation comes into play strongly, because if nobody knew about the vulnerability, would it be an issue? Maybe not. So there are a lot of ideas on how best to then like talk about vulnerabilities, because once it's public, it's kind of an open playing field. So one example of a kind of a strange way to talk about a CVE, this is one of my favorite examples, are this CVE that was published in 2022. And I mentioned previously that when you have references of a vulnerability that's been filed, you'll typically have some kind of proof of concept in the references section. Well, a researcher found this one, and it turned out that all of the references were actually just links to vulnerable systems that have this vulnerability in them. How many of you guys think that that would be an ethical way of doing the reference section? I don't know if we can raise our hands or anything. I guess it depends. It depends on you, but this researcher and the person who published this article actually went to the organization that filed this CVE and said, "Hey, I don't think it's really the right thing to do for you to be, publicly exposing these URLs that have this vulnerability in it for people to exploit." And they said they left it. They said it was okay with them if that's what the author wanted. So just one example of some kind of really different ways of talking about this that may or may not be the right thing to do.
And here's another example of what may or may not be the right thing to do. I will let you decide, but I think it will be pretty obvious. But I like to bring it back to like real life examples of what we've seen and how people disclose these things. And here's a perfect example of something gone horribly wrong. So who here has submitted a CVE? Anyone in the chat? It's okay if not. All right. Well, I'm going to go on a tangent about this, but this one actually came out last summer, and it was claiming to be a vulnerability against one of Sonatype's products, and it was actually a Nexus repository, right? So it was actually a cybersecurity student excited that they had found their first CVE, but unfortunately the research didn't quite add up, and he came to a false conclusion. So when Sonatype actually like reported this, a few weeks later, they were like, well, we were actually contacted with the identical claim a few weeks before. And because of that, they were allowed to responsibly, put a disclosure in the process where they were able to explore what they thought was the vulnerability and come to understand there was actually no problem. So by the student totally skipping that process, they actually risked giving those that are actively attacking the information they needed to exploit that widely used application. So really, with hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people worldwide using it, it's a real alarm bell to be ringing when people are doing that when you probably didn't need to do that.
Yeah, and I think another thing to see from this slide is really that this is a community effort. These CVEs that are published, so anyone can go in and do this. So it's important to properly, vet the CVEs that you're looking at. So Kadi brought up an important point, was that the way that they, in that last CVE example, the way that the student who submitted it disclosed it was not in the best practice that is normally thought of in the industry. So I wanted to talk about what is the best way to be discussing vulnerabilities and to be releasing public information. So there's 3 different ways of doing this. The first one is private disclosure. So what happens with that is, say, a cybersecurity professional or enthusiast finds something that they think is a vulnerability, and they then report privately that information to the organization whose project or product it affects. So what makes this private is then it is then up to that organization whether or not they want to fix this problem, whether they want to publish any details about it or not. And so that can often be done for like bug bounty programs, for example, but it puts all the power into the hands of the organization and may not be the ideal scenario for someone who's reporting it and wants to make the world a little bit safer by leaving it completely up to the organization. So that brings in coordinated disclosure, and you'll often hear it referred to as responsible disclosure as well. Based on that term, I think you can probably guess that this is usually the preferred method when discussing software vulnerabilities. So it starts out the same as private disclosure, where a researcher reports a suspected vulnerability to an organization. However, the difference being that that researcher then will agree upon a timeline that the organization will fix it or come public about it. Otherwise, the researcher will go public with it themselves. So that puts some pressure on the organization to then fix and address the problem. But at the same time, gives them some time to fix it before that information goes public so that fewer people are at risk. And then the third one to think about is full or public disclosure. And that's kind of what we saw in the last example. So instead of having a private conversation with the organization, the researcher just goes public with the information. Sometimes this will occur when there's a breakdown in communication with a coordinated disclosure too. Sometimes researchers don't hear back from organizations, for example, and then a public disclosure might be decided as the best step for that researcher. So there could be at times when you as software professionals come about something that you think is a security vulnerability. Hopefully after this talk, you'll be able to think of more ways to recognize when you're looking at code what could be vulnerable. So the best way for you to disclose something like that are, first of all, often company websites will have some secure emails that you can go to in order to give that information. If it's a GitHub project or a public project, you'll usually, or you should hopefully see a security.md file that should have the security policies and information about how to communicate a vulnerability there too. I've heard, but I have not experienced that servers can sometimes have security files on there too. So if you happen to be in a server that you're not supposed to be in, you can get the information about how to tell people that you were there if you decide to do that, to help them make sure it doesn't happen again. And then in addition to security MD files, there's now on GitHub a private vulnerability reporting tool that you have to enable. And it allows external people to create this. It looks kind of like an issue, but it has more information, as you can see here, and create sort of a private issue that the moderators can go in and address and then publish when the time is right. All right, so we've talked about CVEs, about vulnerability, threat, risk, and CVSS, and then different types of disclosures. Probably the last basic term that we need to talk about is zero-day vulnerability. And you may or may not have heard this term, but it gets thrown around a lot and has a few different meanings, so it can be kind of confusing. But what a zero-day vulnerability is it's some kind of flaw which is either unknown to the vendor, so it's public, or it doesn't have an official patch. So it could have been disclosed through a public disclosure and it's out in the public and there's no fix, or nobody knows it exists, but it's being exploited already. Do you want to tell us give us an example of a zero-day vulnerability, Katie?
Yes, I do. So this is one that maybe some of you have heard of. It's been going on for quite a few months, where this is a great example of a zero-day vulnerability where it wasn't even given a ranking yet. And it was disclosed by the author of it before an associated fix, with an associated fix, sorry. So as you may have heard about this over the past few months, the fallout from the widespread hack of MoveIT's file transfer application has really continued to send ripples across the tech world. And by that, I mean the breach continues to result in continuingly to take sensitive data. One analyst, at Msoft reported that over 200 organizations probably have fallen victim to this exploit. What I find interesting, though, about it is that it's not like looking at one group, like it's targeting anyone and everyone who's using this. And there's really no in between. You have First Merchants Bank, you also have a Medibank in Australia, you have Teachers Pension, you also have some of the government departments. So nobody's really safe from this, and we're continuing to see a spread fallout from it.
So another thing to know is that these types of zero-day vulnerabilities, well, they often will make it into the news like that, but they're actually starting to occur more and more frequently in recent years. So it used to be in the early 2000s that there's been a study done that on average you had about a month from when a vulnerability was published to be able to fix it and release it. But that is not the case anymore. And there's been quite a few studies done showing that when a vulnerability, some kind of vulnerability is published, that even within 15 minutes or a few hours, software can be vulnerable and bad actors will start to try to exploit it. And so that is why learning about cybersecurity and kind of being proactive about it has always been important, but it's becoming even more important these days. So this is the Java user group, although I didn't necessarily hear a lot of people mention Java. I'm assuming some of you may have been affected by this vulnerability. And that was the Log4Shell vulnerability that was, I think, 2 Christmases ago now. Did any of you guys spend some time trying to fixing that over a Christmas break, possibly? I know a lot of people who have. And so this was technically an interesting vulnerability in the JVM, but also in the way that it was disclosed as well. So it had a 10 ranking on the CVSS scale we talked about, which means it was the highest. And that means that it's quite easy to exploit, and it can have a really big impact on systems as well. So this one was often talked about as a 0-day vulnerability. And there are a few different parts of the story that made the disclosure a bit more complicated than that. So with Log4Shell, it actually started out as a coordinated disclosure. So Alibaba reported this to the Apache Foundation, the volunteers of the Apache Foundation. They created a fix and they released it and released their CVE, and people were told to patch it. But it turned out shortly after it wasn't as a complete a fix as they thought. They fixed it as best they could with the knowledge they had, but there was more to follow. So then it became a 0-day vulnerability. There were also not many, but quite a handful of CVEs that were filed after, just relating to this particular library, Log4j. And that's a pretty common thing to see as well with something that causes this much of a stir, is that once a big vulnerability is found, it'll get more eyes on it, both from good actors and bad, and sometimes more vulnerabilities tend to be found there. All right. So what is the difference between these two lines of code? Assuming most of you have written some simple if statements like this, and it's just one character difference, but this was actually the cause of a pretty big stir in the software community last fall, and that was a vulnerability in the OpenSSL library. So tell us about that disclosure and what made that one interesting, Katie.
Sure. So this one was actually interesting and got me to do like a LinkedIn Live with, someone who has way more knowledge than me, just because this one was so different in how it was disclosed. And I think for most of you on the phone, you're like, how could this be different? But from my experience, whenever we've heard about them, they're always like, everything's on fire right now. It's happening today. It's already happened. We don't know where it is. Well, with this one, this happened last year and it came out a week early. Like they notified everyone ahead of time. So you were like knowing it's coming, and it was marked critical before it even came out. So everybody's freaking out, like wondering what's going on. Well, it turns out when they actually allowed people to test the vulnerability and give feedback and practice for the common architectures on platforms it was most likely using, it turns out it was most likely unlikely to be exploited. So there's still a risk of denial for service, which, is more contained than remote code execution. I think the important thing to note is, though, that if you were using this, like, please patch, because that was like, you do need to patch that one. And I think it was like 3.0.7 is the updated one now that you can use. I think the other interesting thing to add to this, that like the overall impact for the data of people who were affected by this shows that like only 1.5 of all open SSL instances were affected. But either way, still patch and move forward. But turns out there was a lot of hype here, and it turned out to be not that exciting. I think how we disclose these things, though, how we disclose to how we pay attention to these disclosures is just simply not enough, right? And that's because we all really do need to pay attention to best practices and best practices with the tooling we can get. I think having that community story where everybody is pitching in and participating in CVEs is good, but it's really difficult to stay on top of projects, and especially the security piece. And then you just sometimes have that whole thing with, vulnerabilities get reported, but they don't get fixed because maybe the maintainer or the company maintaining it, just doesn't understand the significance of what that vulnerability is. And as Theresa pointed out earlier, that was totally the case with Log4Shell. I think, but going back to Log4Shell though, I still can't get over the fact that like someone reported on November 24th, and then all of a sudden fast forward to December 9th. Like, we know it's real because people are complaining because it exploited servers that host Minecraft. So, there were a bunch of kids probably who are very angry, complaining to their parents that day.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of really interesting stories that hopefully you've enjoyed some of the ones we've shared so far, but a lot of them are also not disclosed ever. There's not always like a reason for someone to disclose them, say they're exploiting it for a reason. And so to go right into our next section, that is kind of what we want to share next is, so how can you think about some of these issues proactively and be ready for when, say, the next Log4Shell comes out. So I always like to share this when I talk about cybersecurity because when I was reading a paper that was published by the government last year about software supply chain security, and when they talked about what they categorize as an insider threat for this type of security, one of the things that came up, and this is directly quoted from there, is when you have a poorly trained engineer that can make a mistake and cause an issue. And that really struck a chord with me when I saw that, that I myself could be an insider threat and not know it just because I didn't necessarily take the time to learn some obvious, or not obvious, but pretty low-hanging fruit skills that, like, you don't have to be an expert to prevent all issues, but if you can know the basics to prevent some, that I think is great for not only your career, but for the software community at large. The other thing to think about is typically in a company, the number of developers and the code that's being produced is far more than a security professional can single-handedly keep up with. So by having more security-informed developers, it can be really helpful to the security team to not have to do everything themselves. And I think probably most people in the room know this economics of a bug, which is that the sooner you catch a bug, if it's in design or if it's in the requirement stage, is a lot cheaper to fix than if you're close to a release and then you have to go back and fix a security organization. So the more that we know early, the better. So what can we do about this? So as I mentioned, it's important to be somewhat informed about security, but it's hard for everybody to be an expert, and I don't think that's a feasible thing to ask. So one thing I wanted to mention, perhaps some of your organizations are doing this already, is that one strategy that some companies have is to have a security champions program, it's called. So this is someone who is on a development team who isn't necessarily an expert in security, but is just the advocate and the spokesperson for security and security education on that team. So that can look like different things at different companies. It can just be the person who goes in and reviews code and is thinking only about security, for example, and looking for bugs that they may think may be problematic. Could be someone that is in charge of helping educate the team about security, or helping have some contact with security teams when there's an issue. So that is a program that I know has been really effective at some companies to do. But individually, the first thing to learn about when it comes to cybersecurity is probably the OWASP top 10. And I'm sure that the security professionals in the room are really familiar with this, but if you're not, it is a list of the top 10 security risks to software applications. It's published every few years. And as you can see, but from year to year, or at least the last couple times it was published, the list did not change considerably. So there's room for improvement when it comes to writing code, because clearly, even though there's these lists are being published, we're not really getting that much better at preventing a lot of these issues. So if you're not familiar, some of these I think you can look at and then it may be fairly obvious, but some of them not so much. So if you're not familiar, I definitely encourage you to take a look at those.
So I think this is like continuing on the OWASP thread. I think it's interesting too, because I often wonder, like, how do we keep up with the ever-changing tech, right? Like there's always something new that's coming and you're just not going to know what it is. And then the question really is how do you keep that secure? And large language models are like the hip thing right now, right? So who's used ChatGPT? I mean, I definitely have. So there's questions around like this type of, thank you, Theresa. There's questions around this type of technology though. And, you know, how do we keep making this safe? So about back, you know, a while back, there was actually a working group that was created in OWASP to kind of start exploring this stuff. And then in July, OWASP actually released, you know, the mini version of the top 10 threats for large language models. So we got to see a preview of it. And then on August 1st, they actually released the full version. So what you're seeing on the right here is straight out of the report, which we can give you guys the link to the resource for this at the end, because it's actually a really interesting read. And what I think is pretty cool about it, it's really laser focused and has a singular mission that it really just wants to illuminate, you know, the security pitfalls that come with these LLMs like ChatGPT. And it's designed not only to educate developers, but it's also like a diverse, you run the spectrum of who can be involved. So that's developers, designers, architects, managers, organizations as a whole, right? So they're really looking as a think tank to take anybody in. So if this is something of interest to you, you know, feel free to raise your hand, because they're actively looking to see people in the community to stay engaged with this so they can stay current and the latest with what's happening. And I think that's important because it's keeping pace with the time, right? So I think it also depends a little bit on human nature, right? Some of us want to rely on it too much, but it also has pitfalls, which you'll see in this report. I think that's all I have for that one. Sorry, I just noticed. I was like, I think that's it for that one.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you're not familiar with these lists, definitely take a look at the top 10. And if you're interested or looking at large language models, this was a really cool thing that just came out like last month. Well, within the last few weeks, I think.
Mm-hmm. About 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So other than being familiar with types of vulnerabilities, there's also some other things that you may not necessarily think about as being secure, that aren't security specific, but can still be really helpful. So one thing to consider is how fast is your release process. So we talked a lot about 0-day vulnerabilities before, and how there can be bad actors trying to exploit systems within roughly 15 minutes. And while it may not necessarily be a reasonable time frame for someone to get out a fix, it's something to think about these days. Really is how fast can you get out a fix once it's there? Even the time it takes to go through the pipeline can really save you a lot of damage. So the reason I put up this slide is that for the best story that I've heard, example of this really mattering is, for example, when Log4Shell came out. So I was chatting with the manager who runs Maven Central at Sonatype, and it just so happened that about a year before the Log4Shell vulnerability came out, they had reason to be able to expand the capacity at which publishers could upload dependencies, and they could have a high capacity to be able to have people all upload at once. And it just so happened that then when Log4Shell came out and the entire Java ecosystem because Log4j is used so heavily, everyone needed to fix their project. And as you can tell right at the beginning here, this is the number of downloads that people had, but of vulnerable versions, and a lot of that came from downloading packages that had the vulnerable version in them. And so as an industry, we were able to patch and mitigate all of that fairly quickly, in part because so many people were able to publish at the same time and do it quickly. But so that's something to be thinking about, is how fast is your release process and how fast can you get vulnerabilities patched. All right, so we've talked a lot about what you can think about in your own applications, but the other piece of this puzzle when it comes to writing software is, of course, as I alluded to before, open source dependencies. So these days, I like to put this picture of Niagara Falls because that's really close to where I live. But if you think of software development as a waterfall attacking individual applications, if it's for a really big company that has really important information, yes, of course, that's going to be valuable. But for an attacker that's maybe looking for more low-hanging fruit, attacking dependencies can be more impactful because it can impact many applications at the same time that are being used by many more. And actually, about 90% of the average enterprise Java application is composed of dependencies, not in-house code. And if you don't think you're using open source, you very likely still are. And so because there's such a big risk here in applications that it's being used so heavily, and because it can attack many, by attacking open source projects, you can attack many systems at the same time, there's a really big target on libraries. So some of the different types, the most common that you will encounter is typo squatting is one. So for example, someone could upload to, usually it doesn't happen on Maven Central, but if you're a Python user, possibly like PyPy or NPM for JavaScript, that there will be a package uploaded that has a slightly different version or a slightly different name than something that's pretty popular, and people may accidentally download it, and then you have malware on your system. And there's, of course, what you would probably typically think of as an attack on a project, which is on an open source project, which is trying to get code in that may contain something malicious that you can exploit and get it past the maintainers. Takes a little bit more time. Build tool attacks. So usually when we talk about supply chain attacks, I think people think of dependencies that get pulled into an application. And while that is true, build tools that you have, such as the IDE you use every day, are also susceptible to attacks and can also be damaging. So it's important to keep not only dependencies that go to production up to date, but also the tools that are used along the way. And then the final one that is pretty common with dependencies is dependency confusion. And so that is this example down here on the right, is that say I, as an attacker, found a way to steal the credentials to be able to publish to a popular package. I could push a package with a really high version number, and that could cause some people's systems to automatically download that version. If it says, oh, look, a new release has come out, then that could be problematic as well.
All right, I know we're a little over time, so I'm gonna go through this a little quicker. But I wanted to talk about some resources. So Theresa's done a great job of highlighting the different ways of disclosures, different types of stories that can happen, and the different types of attacks. So I wanted to talk, and OWASP is obviously a good resource as well, but I wanted to talk about how a lot of times we often think that vulnerabilities is just like a licensing risk or a security risk that is, that is a risk to open source. But in reality, it's like security vulnerabilities, and it's also operational risks. So at my company, we actually put together a report where we talk about that because it's a little bit more encompassing. So you're getting some of that operational side as well as the security side. And because if you think about it, right, in that 90% of code that is open source that you're using, it's been found that 95% of the vulnerabilities actually exist in transitive dependencies. So you don't even know if you're using it. And that creates a lot of noise when you do have something like Log4Shell. Problem comes, can you reach it, right? So you might know if you're using it or not, but can you reach it? Are you actually using that feature? Are you actually using that function? And until you can figure that out, it's a ripple effect, right? So this is one report that can help you kind of sift through that noise. And then if you go to the next slide, there are tools out there that can actually help you to kind of sift through that noise. So this is just one example of our UI where you can actually see how we're filtering the vulnerabilities based on criticality, things like that. Is there a patch? And are you actually using it? So on the right, you'll be able to see if it's transitive or a direct dependency, but also if you're using it, right? And if you're using it, that means you do need to fix it. There's also things in there too that can kind of help to ease some of that heartburn, because I know like you just get so overwhelmed from so many security notifications. And again, it's which ones matter. How do I prioritize this? And we can actually help you do that by prioritizing the vulnerabilities based on, several different rating systems and kind of combining that in a score. But what I personally think is the best is you're actually getting to the heart of the matter by getting that call path. So you're actually knowing where it is, how it's affected, and what to fix. Because without that call path, you're kind of like, is it actually there? Is it not? So there's some kind of proof point for you when you are looking to go fix these things. But then again, there's also free tools, which I believe Teresa's going to talk about.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely having all tooling is really is important to be able to address these kind of issues, but I think the call path is especially important for prioritization. I have also heard quite a bit, like sometimes people will say, oh, just because it's not in my call path doesn't means it's not an issue that I should care about and I should ignore it in my tooling. And that is not necessarily true either. It may be low priority to address, but just because you're not using it in your code, that doesn't mean that somebody can't hack into your system and then use that vulnerable code for something else later. So it's still important, even though it's not in your call path, but potentially less important. Yeah, so in addition to scanning tools, that there are many of them, and there are free ones, there are paid ones. They all use different, possibly slightly different data, which could be the biggest difference. But I also wanted to call out, there's been some cool work being done from open source foundations. So for example, CNCF has the CLO Monitor project that's based on OpenSSF Scorecard project, and MITRE also has one too. And these basically go in and score open source projects based on how well they are following best practices. And Sonatype actually went and did a study on some of this data and showed that, actually, projects that are following best practices do tend to have less vulnerabilities and are predicted to have less in the future. So there is some merit to it. So this is a great thing to look at if you're potentially looking for a new project and you just want to see how seriously is this project taking security if you're deciding to use a new project. All right, so when it comes to security, who can we trust? So third-party projects, maybe we can trust them. So I was just mentioning there's tools like Scorecard and the CLO Monitor and MITRE hip check that can help give some indication for who we can trust. What about the open source repositories like Maven Central and PyPy and NPM? Usually you can't rely on these. In the Java ecosystem, we're doing a little bit better than some because Maven Central has namespaces and user validation that tends to keep out a lot of typo squatting attacks, for example, but still can't completely rely on these to be error-free. And actually, in Maven Central, they don't actually take down vulnerable packages, so they don't break anyone. So you definitely can't rely on them filtering those out for you. Scanning tools are definitely helpful. There can be some false positives with some of them depending on what you're using, so it's important to vet these properly. But ultimately, the people who's responsible for vulnerabilities or risk is going to be you and all of us and the projects we're working on. So it's important to be informed about the choices that you're making. All right, so just to wrap up, we've learned today about vulnerability and threat equaling risk. We've learned about CVEs, CVSS scoring, and the disclosure process and different ways about how that's done. So next time you hear a security story in the news, hopefully you can look at it with a bit of a different lens on how that was handled. We talked about the OWASP top 10 and things to learn about if you're not familiar with them already, and dependency management and considerations that you should have when you're going about your jobs writing your code. Cybersecurity can be fairly overwhelming. There's a lot to learn and a lot to keep up with. So I always like to have a reminder that you're never going to be able to fix everything, and you're never going to be able to know everything, but something is always better than nothing. So don't lose heart and just go at it from little bits. And that is all we have for you. Do you have anything to add, Katie? I think I just went full steam ahead at the end there.
Yeah, I think I just want to say thank you for everyone's time. We can get the slides out because there were some really good links in there. I think the reports and some of the best practices are really good things for people to look at. And then, you know, if you want, follow It's 505 because that's where we have a lot of, at least for me, that's where a lot of journalists have been putting in their open source and cybersecurity updates. So you'll see people from all over the world who actually contribute. So it's just a good way to stay up to date, but being at things like this is also a great way too.
Yeah, and if you're interested in learning more, there's a couple of learning links there too. So the first one is a free course from the Linux Foundation that's all about cybersecurity, and it does a pretty good job of covering like everything you should know, sort of what we talked about, but in way more detail. And I think they have LinkedIn badges too. So
I believe they do.
Yes. Something that I found really helpful.
It gives you street cred. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, why not? Cool. Do you guys have any questions?
I know we're like way over time, but.
Just to say or ask anything? Okay. So thank you very much. This was great. I definitely would love to have you here in person. I hope I will see you in a conference for the very least. It's a shame that Java 1 is not going to happen. So we may have to wait for DevNexus, but
yep. Yeah,
maybe there will be something before that.
Thank you so much for having us. And it was really great to meet all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Appreciate it.